right? I guess I'm on. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as the case may be. I'm Nitya Rajmadugu, and I'm a VP at this DEKRA Certification, Inc. And I have been in this cybersecurity field for quite some time, for like 25 plus years. And I am speaking from Virginia, which is close to Washington, D.C. And I want to thank Medcrypt for this invite and giving me an opportunity to talk about the certifications that we could do for cybersecurity's relevance. Thank you. Vidya.
Hey everyone, my name is Vidya Murthy. I serve as COO at Medcrypt. I've been in security my whole career and for the last 10 years focused on healthcare in particular. In my experience working at a medical device manufacturer, I had a lot of trying to discuss with hospitals and consumers of our devices how our products met their expectations. And here at Medcrypt, I serve to help get devices through the FDA that are more secure without compromising on innovation. Axel?
Thank you. Yeah, Axel Worth. I'm the Chief Security Strategist here at Medcrypt. I have been in healthcare my entire professional career, but in 2008 I actually started to work in cybersecurity with focus on the healthcare industry, and within the first year encountered the first hospital that actually was experiencing a cybersecurity incident impacting their medical devices. It was a medication cabinet where a traveling service technician introduced a malware worm to one device. It spread to over 100 devices across multiple hospital locations and shut down all cabinets for about a week until they all got restored. And that kind of piqued my interest in the topic of cybersecurity as it pertains to medical devices, and as I assume everybody knows on the call here, regulations since then have developed, and I think it is an important topic for all of us these days. Kate, next slide, please. So obviously, if you talk about cybersecurity and healthcare, the first thing that comes to mind, at least here in the US, is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, short also known as HIPAA. Specifically, what drives the discussion there is the privacy rule, which is about the protection of health information. And it applies actually to all information about a patient's health status, including billing, treatment, diagnosis, and so forth. And it includes anything written, spoken, electronic, doesn't matter. The HIPAA security rule, on the other hand, is specific to electronic information, and it establishes a set of administrative, technical, and physical safeguards that so-called covered entities, healthcare providers and their business associates need to comply with in order to demonstrate compliance with the HIPAA security rule. And fines can be levied if there are violations that are found either due to a security incident or due to an audit. Specifically, we have the breach notification rule since 2009, which requires that organizations report within 60 days any breach that affects more than 500 individuals, and they are then published by Health and Human Services on the so-called wall of shame. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. Now, if you're not a healthcare provider, if you are, for example, a supplier to hospitals, be it software services, products, medical devices, you are impacted by HIPAA in several ways. One is, of course, your buyers may make requirements part of their purchasing contract, right? So they may basically state, yes, I as a healthcare provider have to comply with HIPAA, but the products I buy from you as a supplier need to enable me to be compliant, right? So that could come at you via, again, contracts. But also, you may actually be considered a business associate under HIPAA if, for example, you provide hosted services or value-added services that impact your customers' protected health information. So if you're processing, storing, analyzing, and so forth, any patient data on behalf of your customers, you are under HIPAA a business associate, and you are required to sign a business associate agreement, which defines your requirements under HIPAA relative to your customers, the healthcare provider. There are certainly some narrow exceptions. So, for example, there is the case of incidental exposure. So, for example, if you don't typically process protected health information, but are exposed accidentally, that is not considered a violation. The classic example is if you're running a repair shop for photocopiers and one of your technicians encounters patient data on a sheet of paper that is left on the glass of the photocopier, that is not considered a HIPAA violation, that is an incidental exposure. Similar, there are narrow exceptions for disclosure of protected health information if it is properly anonymized, and HIPAA has very specific requirements on what that means. But again, if data is anonymized and de-identified and meets the HIPAA requirements for de-identification, then again, you may be exempt from being considered a business associate. Kate, next slide, please. Now, back to the HIPAA breach notification rule. We have, since 2009, mandatory reporting requirements for any breach that affects more than 500 individuals. That gives us a good overview of trends and breaches we encounter in the healthcare industry, with obviously some considerations and some limitations. First of all, HIPAA defines a breach as the actual unauthorized disclosure of health information. So any security incident that does not include the breach of data and the disclosure of data is not reportable, so it's not included here. Second, this is based on self-reporting, and obviously each organization's interpretation of what needs to be reported and how it needs to be reported it can be different. So there's some uncertainty in the data, as again, organizations may report different. Nevertheless, I think it does point a scary picture with regards to the state of cybersecurity in healthcare. We've seen since 2010 the number of reported breaches more than triple. We also see, if you look at the yellow category, which are hacking and IT incidents, meaning malicious attacks, that is actually the sole driver for growth since 2015. Right? So really what we've seen here is that that healthcare organizations are experiencing a large number of attacks driven by ransomware type of incidents, where cyber criminals realize that healthcare is a relatively weak industry, but also secondly, that it is an industry with a high pressure to restore data and restore operations, and therefore is more likely to pay relative to other industries. We also see, if you look at the blue category, that the theft, the physical theft of things like laptops and external hard drives actually has gone down, both in absolute numbers, but also as a percentage. And that is due to the fact that if devices that are stolen had been encrypted, then they're exempt from breach notification. So this is an example how regulation and policy can actually change behavior and improve security, as proven in the blue category, but also that we still have a lot of work to do, as proven by the yellow category. So again, since 2009, we have seen more than tripling in incident, almost 6,000 reported breaches. 80% of those roughly are from healthcare providers, 20% are from health insurers and business associates. And we have breached a total of almost 500 million patient records, and if you followed the press about what has happened in 2024, I haven't looked at the numbers yet, but once we look at the full year numbers, I think we will actually set another very unfortunate record for the calendar year 2024. And with that, I hand off to Vidya to talk about some other regulations, including the FDA.
Thanks, Axel. So for those for whom it may not be obvious, the FDA is the regulator here in the US market that manages the safety of devices. And since software was introduced into medical devices back in 2014, the FDA started issuing specific guidances that speak to security of devices. Now, this is a big change for the FDA's historical model. When you create a pill, the pill is the same formula every time, theoretically, right? And you test it that once, and then it kind of proceeds. Software is obviously different in that the moment that you write software and you push it out the door, it's almost guaranteed to become deprecated in some period of time, and you then have to maintain it. So there's a bit of a challenge where historically the FDA has created guidances and expectations for device makers and not necessarily had a mechanism to enforce those. But one of the trends we've seen is that the FDA has really changed how they're thinking about security and how they put security across the board during their enforcement process. So the core thing that that the FDA really, the intention, right, is that they view security as a patient safety consideration. If security could somehow be compromised and that would change the operational efficacy of a device, that's a problem, and that impacts patient safety. And so the intention with how they view security in maintenance is that it has to have both a process to demonstrate security before it gets to the market, they call that pre-market, and then once it's out in the field and operational, they call it post-market. Now, interestingly, as part of the FDA's view on pre-market expectations, you also need to submit your post-market management process. So it's not something that they're saying, hey, once you're out in the field, then you deal with this thing. They're really saying we expect this to be a cohesive strategy for the whole life cycle of the device at the point of you coming to the FDA for approval. Now, for those who don't know, there are two specific guidances in particular that you should be aware of, the pre-market and the post-market. And for both of those, they really call out in a higher level of granularity than they have historically expectations around what that should include and demonstrate when a device is getting ready for submission. Kate, could you go to the next one? So one of the things that we break down here are kind of three main categories. There are certain things that are procedural and are process driven, meaning they have to occur both during the development of the device as well as after the device is out in the field. There's a bucket of things that can be solved with some product and technology interventions to make it maintained over time. And then there's a lot of documentation to support this. So from a process perspective, I'm not going to go bullet by bullet here, but the intention here is that they really want to see the security of a device be embedded into how quality management systems work for a device maker. Currently, a lot of requirements for security live independent of the QMS. They aren't necessarily embedded in the same process where you have QA driving a lot of security. Instead, oftentimes devices get to a milestone and then somebody says, hey, what about the security thing that we're starting to hear about? What should we do? What the guidance really says is if you truly embed security into your quality management system, all these bullets are going to become normal processes that you go through, not just for the one time you push your device through the FDA, but on an ongoing basis. So major releases and when you're doing updates, next gen development, all those sorts of things. One of the poll questions that's out there talks about some of the cryptography requirements that we're seeing. The FDA has historically, along with other regulators, not been so specific in terms of saying, hey, we want you to use 256-bit encryption. But when it comes to cryptography, they are in fact saying that there are specific protocols that they recommend a device manufacturer consider. And that includes both FIPS 140-3 as well as a NIST standard. The point in calling it out in the poll, I think a lot of folks have historically said the FDA is not prescriptive in what they want to see from device makers. And in fact, we're seeing them become more specific than I think we've seen historically with what they want to see. As the maturity around the enforcement of this grows, we expect the guidances to also become more mature in terms of what they expect to see. At Medcrypt, we have a lot of visibility to device manufacturers that are working their way through the FDA. One of the core things we've seen anecdotally is that the FDA has started giving feedback to device makers that is meaningfully more detailed than we've perhaps seen, and a bit more complicated in terms of how they're analyzing the security posture of devices. So we're seeing the enforcement going up in terms of breadth and scope for device makers. The last section that's really called out in the pre-market guidance focuses on documentation. For anyone that's had to turn in your design history file or other documentation to your QMS, you know that documentation really is the backbone of how the FDA assesses whether something has been done. So with insufficient documentation, there's nothing really for the regulator to glom onto and say, hey, this is how we think security is going to work in your device, and that's good or bad. You need to have your documentation reflect not just the point in time, but your processes that are going to go after things are out in the field. And then a lot of customers we're finding have increased their maturity in terms of expectations, to the point where sometimes they're asking for more than what the regulator is asking for, or more frequency, or different level of detail sometimes. So having documentation that both reflects current stature as well as ongoing procedures is becoming increasingly scrutinized by multiple consumers in this space. Okay, you can go to the next one. I alluded to the fact that there's two main buckets. So that was the pre-market population of expectations. There's also this post-market, and this is the idea of once your device is out in the field, how do you maintain some security posture around that device? One of the biggest things here is that you want to be able to understand what is happening with your device. And that can sometimes be hard when you're operating in a third party's network, where you don't have continuous connectivity to your device and you can't necessarily see what's happening, or if your device is periodically online or unpredictably online. So there are a lot of what are relatively unique cases in healthcare that are quite ubiquitous, right? So your thermostat to monitor your house is pretty much connected all the time. But is the pacemaker in a person going to be constantly sending a signal? Maybe it's intermittent. So having some consideration for that means that some of these post-market functions are actually harder to achieve with off-the-shelf technology that isn't built for device makers. What we find most frequently is that you need to make architectural choices that will enable post-market vigilance during the design process relatively early on. And if some of those decisions are made with the intention of post-market vigilance, you're able to keep that security posture not just up to date, but also actively updated by having good architecture choices that allow you to maintain the device. The one that I would call out most explicitly here is the risk mitigation for continued patient safety. And one of the core things that in the latest guidance references is this notion of what I'd call the multiplier effect, right? The idea that there could be a single vulnerability that impacts an entire fleet of devices is something that the FDA expressed concerns around. And so knowing how your patient care is going to be impacted if a single device is found to be vulnerable is something that is under added scrutiny right now. So what's one to do? You have not just the FDA's expectations. If you're selling into multiple markets, you might have European Union expectations. You might have Australia, Japan. There's a whole multitude of security expectations that various regulators have put into place. And you find that folks then sometimes combine other guidances, and maybe they go with the lowest common denominator and say, okay, I'm going to do the least amount possible. And then when there are exceptions, I'll manage those exceptions. And what we find frequently with folks that try to pursue that strategy is at scale, that just completely falls off and you aren't able to sustain it. What I mean by that is if I'm trying to manage things on an exception basis, there just become too many exceptions for how security should work. And all of a sudden, you're trying to bolt on different types of security for different regulators. And that's really difficult to both build at the time as well as maintain over the lifetime of a device. So what we find to be most successful at scale is really this idea of prioritizing what is going to satisfy the most requirements. And that really means having a strong understanding of what the various regulators are asking for and what markets matter for your device. Now, there are some device makers who have deeply different devices for different markets, and that's one strategy that could be employed. But for those that are trying to use a single version of your device for multiple markets, you really need to understand and harmonize what those expectations are and try to achieve them using the same level of effort across the board. So alluding to this, a lot of what happens in security is not necessarily understood by those who are managing the clinical function of a device. So really start by understanding by knowing what the requirements are for your various regulators. This one calls out cryptography in particular. And the idea is that a lot of times a security requirement can be obscure to somebody that's trying to build new clinical features. So if you can say, hey, you know, if we had connectivity, we could do this new novel clinical thing. A great example, there was a surgical robot manufacturer who said, you know, the capital equipment expenditure is just way too high for me to get into the Asian market. Instead of selling it, I want to be able to lease it and then charge on a per procedure basis. Sounds like a great idea on paper, right? What they found is once they installed some of their devices, the counts were significantly lower than what they had predicted. And as they started triaging it to figure out what happened, they found that the count had been bypassed from a security perspective, and the hospital was artificially keeping it low so that they paid less. Now imagine if somebody had cryptographically signed the procedure requirement and you had been able to track how many procedures were being done without someone being able to bypass that. Then you would have had a more solid business case for being able to proceed with this leasing model. Now, what I guess ultimately I'm trying to say, right? Security is often perceived as a cost center. And I think for device makers, cryptography in particular can actually open up a multitude of both clinical functionality as well as novel business models if you truly understand how cryptography and trusted communication is being used by your device. And then the last thing I would highly emphasize here is embedding security into a quality management system is key for sustaining it over time. I alluded to the regulator maturing. Everywhere you turn, somebody's talking about AI, ML, and LLMs and how data is the way. Can't really do a lot of that unless you have confidence in the data that your device is pulling back. And if it isn't trusted in terms of communication, you can't prove that it has integrity, and you're going to run into a hard position to be able to justify whatever net new thing you're trying to develop. So building it into your existing QMS is really a solid strategy to get started. Cool. So as mentioned, at Medcrypt, we work a lot with security, particular for device manufacturers, covering that whole continuum of technology support, documentation support, as well as procedural and tooling to help maintain security posture over time. And one of the core things that we focus on is on a cryptography solution that really enables trusted communication to occur. And that is a big driver for why we have partnered with DEKRA in this webinar, so we could talk more about trusted communication and how that can be achieved using a solid cryptography strategy. So I'll turn it over to Nithya to pick it up from here.
All right. Thank you, Vidya. I appreciate that, the segue and the introduction to the cryptography and to the FIPS program as such. So let me start by with a little story of why we need this certification. I'm going to actually talk about two different types of certification. One is the FIPS 140-3 that Vidya mentioned, and the other one is a common criteria certification. So why do we need this certification, right? So I'll start with the story. The other day I was at the doctor's office, and they always make you wait. So I was waiting, looking around, and then on the walls, I saw all these credentials of the doctor. That kept me thinking that, hey, I see all this, but I don't see any certification of the network. That is as important as the credential of the doctor. We are assuming so much in the medical field as a user. I'm asking for referrals of the doctor. I want to see if he's got a good certificate, graduated from a good college, and I want to see his experience. I want to see all the things that relate to his work. But I'm not looking at the other essential part, which is the network, which is the technology that he's using, right? When we go into the doctor's office in the front desk, there's a network person. Then you see the doctor walking in with the tablet. He's typing in all his medication, all the diagnosis, and then that's going on a wireless network. And then we see that there's a medication, insulin pump or some medication dispensing device. These are all monitored remotely. Many times they are monitored remotely, and the control is somewhere else, somewhere even closer to the patient. But are we making sure that these are secure, right? Are we making sure that there is a sound crypto there? I have never asked that question. Maybe in future I'll start asking, but I've never asked that question. Do you have a secure network? Do you have a sound crypto? Or I've even not even asked whether have you upgraded your software, hardware, or do you have a good backup? These are very crucial, but we never ask that. We just take it for granted that it exists and it's looked after by somebody. But these systems, unlike the systems in other areas like the financial areas or just the network security areas, are not certified. They're just you're recommended to use a good crypto, but there is no certification behind that. So I want to introduce the FIPS certification, which deals with this crypto usage, so to speak. Right? So why are we not asking the banking information? If there is a breach, we get to know about it. If there is an identity that is stolen, we get to know about it. But from the medical field, if there is a breach of information, they have my personal information, all my personal information. And this is critical information that is flowing through the network, because if there is an issue and a wrong medication is given or wrong dosage is delivered, it's a life and death situation. So it is essential, and these systems are also liable to be, attacked by anybody, right? Data leaks could be there. There could be a ransomware. There could be a cloud attack, or there could be even be a supply chain attack. So these are important things and we believe that they are working properly, but there is no regulated requirement which is mandated. And FIPS is something that I want to introduce, which could do a part of this, take a part of this responsibility. Now let's go to NIST. NIST it stands for National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it's a division, Department of Commerce division, and it actually publishes strong cryptographic algorithm for use for everyone. And FIPS 140-3 is a program which ensures that these strong algorithms are used, and they are implemented correctly, and they are used in a secure manner. So with that, let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so the crypto, so this slide tells you why do we have the NIST program, what does it deal with, who are the people who are working with it. So NIST, as I said, it writes these standards, and 140-3 is a FIPS program, and FIPS stands for Federal Information Processing Standards, and 140 is the number. NIST gives a number for every standard that they come up with. 140 is the number. The -3 that you see is actually the third revision of the 140 standard. And this is a joint program. It's a certification process, and it is a joint program between the US and the Canadian government. It's also an ISO validated program. 19790 is the ISO number. And who needs FIPS? FIPS, right? And what are the products that go through this? FIPS is used and are certified. The person who certifies are labs, and we are one of the labs which do the testing on behalf of the US government. And the product that we do is any network product, anything that uses crypto, right? If it could be a hardware, software, or a firmware that has crypto inside it. And the piece that is validated or certified is called a module. Usually it's called as a crypto module, and a crypto module need not be the whole product. It could be part of the product. And why do the people go for FIPS certification? It is actually mandated in the US government for any product that are used in the US government network. It is not mandated in the health industry, but Veterans Administration suggests that you have, they recommend and they look for these certification, FIPS certification, but it's not mandated. But the government, US government, whenever it buys an electronic product that has cryptography, it needs you to have a FIPS certification for it. So what would be the applications? You could have a diabetic pumps. You could have, as I mentioned, doctor notes, which they dictate into the dictations on the diagnosis that they do, and even patient storage records, which are stored either in the on site, or they are stored somewhere else on the cloud, right? And I've already mentioned cryptographic module, what that is. Next slide, please. All right, so what is the process? The process is multi-step. The first step is the first step is of the process is the vendor or the person who is manufacturing. In this case, a medical device manufacturer would go to accredited lab. We are one of the accredited labs, DEKRA is, for testing. So they contract with the lab, and then they have to provide a certain number of documents to them. For example, the easiest to give us an example is the user guide, admin guide, configuration guide, and then and how they have to describe how, what keys that they use, what crypto functionality they use, and how they use it, and for what purpose they use that. So those documents are given to the lab. The lab does an assessment of that. It does some source code reviews. It does some hands-on testing. There are some, test cases that are to make sure that if the product breaks for any reason, that the keys are not leaked out. So those kinds of tests are done. There are some tests for initial startup. Whenever the machine comes up or the device comes up, they have to do some self-test to make sure that everything is still consistent and reliable. So once the lab does all those testing, they write the documents, they write a report and a recommendation and give that to the government, which is in this picture is written as CMVP, which is the Cryptographic Module Validation Program, which is the NIST, the folks. So we send it to the NIST folks, and the NIST folks then review our report, and they have questions, and when we give them the answers, and then when they're satisfied with the responses, they issue the certificate, and the certificate gets published on their website. So this is a third-party tested, government-approved certification, right? So this bears a lot of credibility. It has value everywhere. And NIST is as being the US government and the Canadian government together. So this certificate is really well worth the time and the effort that you put on that. Next slide, please. So what do you do to be successful? NIST, as I mentioned, has approved algorithms. These algorithms, these list of algorithms undergo a lot of testing at NIST by the NIST folks. But so the US government NIST section actually does test these and break them. For example, right now they have come up and approved 3 types of quantum safe algorithms, right? So they go through before they did that, they did an open competition. So cryptographers could apply to that and send their implementation for the post-quantum algorithms. And then those were tested, those were proved to be slightly stronger than others. So NIST has actually picked up 3 of them and published them. And these are published for all open, everybody. It's not just for US, it's not for just the cryptographers or only for the FIPS implementers. So you must use one of those crypto algorithms, which are considered to be very strong. And they are also watching, right? Every time there is a vulnerability reported, they make sure that that is fixed. They make sure that the world gets to know, or everybody gets to know, that there is a vulnerability. And unless you know there is vulnerability in the algorithms, you wouldn't know, right? And then they periodically maintain it in terms of deprecate older ones and come up with new ones. So my strong suggestion is use NIST approved algorithms. Then get these algorithms certified by through the CAVP program. So CAVP program is a certification program for just the algorithms. And this is a very small effort and small time it takes, but it proves that you are using the correct implementation of the algorithm. So get an algorithm certification. And then there is, if the product is also generating a key, then there is another certification called ESV certification, that is the entropy certification. So that's the next step that you can go through. So these are, you're taking baby steps to the next step, which is the full product validation. It is called the full module validation. And there is a list that I've given on the slide. There is a list, there is an URL you can go to see all these products which are validated by NIST, and that's the full product validation. If you do these baby steps, you would be a leader and you'll be raising the bar on the security. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit about the DEKRA. DEKRA has 2 labs. One is in the US and the other one is in Spain. And the services that we provide are, we do a pre-assessment. So the day that you walk in and say, hi, I want to do an module validation or even a CAVP validation, you may not be ready. The product may not be ready. You don't know what the gaps are. So we do a pre-assessment. We also provide the services of writing these documents that I mentioned. Then, of course, our bread and butter, we do evaluations, which is basically making sure that the product works as was supposed to work and the algorithms are implemented correctly. And I already mentioned the algorithm certification and the ESV certification, which are a smaller certification for the whole module to work. To be certified, you need the algorithms to be independently certified, and you also need an ESV if the module or if the product generates its own cryptographic keys. So these are the certification. These are the services that we provide. We also, in some cases, we if you don't have enough budget for it, but you need just a third-party testing without all the paperwork and all the time, then we do provide those certain, we do the testing by ourselves, and then we provide a compliance letter to say, hey, we as an accredited lab have tested this, and the testing part, the implementation part has been verified, but it's not been certified. So that helps some. If your budget is limited budget, you don't have enough time to finish all this evaluation and you want to just get the meat of the certification process. Next slide, please. So this, I'll go quickly over this. This is, again, about DEKRA, and we are certified, as I said, accredited labs. So there's accreditation or certification. We are supposed to, as an accredited lab, every time we mention we are accredited, we are supposed to provide the lab code, so legally and by NIST rules. So this is the certificate. These are the lab codes. And as I said, we have two labs, one is in the US and one in Spain. And so we can cover both sides of the pond, so to speak. Next slide, please. Okay, all right. So with that, I'm going to go to the next certification process. So the next certification process is called common criteria, and it is usually written as CC. All that the terminology used is CC. I mentioned that about the doctor's office, right? So the cryptography part is taken care of by FIPS. But what about the management of these networks? But the networks have to be managed, they have to be monitored, maintained, upgraded, they have to be patched when there is, when there's vulnerabilities, you need to do backup, you need to do scan it, periodically scan for viruses, need to monitor it for threat detection, and also any vulnerabilities that are reported, you need to make sure that it's not affects you, so you got to mitigate it. So to do this entire thing, to certify that you are doing this process and doing it correctly, there is another certification process, that is the common criteria. It's basically a cradle to grave process and functionality verification by a third party, basically. So then with all this digital transformation, more and more equipments are tied together and they work together, and therefore there is more intercommunication. So you need to make sure that the protocols that are used for communication is good. So common criteria takes care of all these things. The FIPS takes care of just the crypto piece, and common criteria takes care of everything else around that. So common criteria in the US, let me start with US, is run by another US division, which is the NIAP, NIAP, which is National Information Assurance Partnership. And this is a division of NSA. And NSA is the one which runs this program. Again, the same similar pattern of having a lab which does the testing and recommends it for common criteria certification, and the certificate is issued by the government for government procurements. Mostly currently it is used mainly for government procurement because it's mandated. All right. Having said that, let's talk about what the CC program is. So a CC program or a common criteria program is international, as although FIPS is only US and Canada, common criteria is currently like 26 countries and expanding ever so. So if you look at the bottom, you have all the all the flags of the different countries which are participating in this. So it is an international program. The way it differs from FIPS is that it has, the standard is the same, but each country issues their own certificate. So they issue their own certificate, they have their own labs, they work independently, they do not share the reports that from one country to another, but the standard is the same. So they are governed, self-governed, and they have shadow audits between the countries, certifiers, so that they know that it is the level of scrutiny is about the same, and the level of testing is the same, but they are all independent in issuing their own certificate. So they have a mutual recognition. Because of this, they have a mutual recognition arrangement called MRA, and that means if you get the certificate, if you test it, get the certificate under one country, it is applicable and it is recognized by another country. So the products that are, I think I've stepped through many of these already. So supporting documents, again, the process is the same in the sense that they have supporting documents that the vendor has to give to the lab, and they are looked at, and the supporting documents are described in this common criteria documentation, requirements documentation. They look at all kinds of requirements. They look at not just the key part. For the key portion, when you have a crypto within the common criteria, every country has independent policies. Like the US and Canada want the FIPS certification for the crypto part, whereas Germany and other countries have their own certification or labs for the crypto part, and they go with that. So there are some differences, but by and large, they are the same process, right? And I think I've stepped through it, all the points in the next slides, please. All right. So this again, I said, I mentioned the CCRA, or the Common Criteria Recognition Arrangement, which is also called the MRA, Mutual Recognition Arrangement, is between all these countries. And these countries say that the main idea is to be able to, for the products to be tested and evaluated at one shop, one lab and one country, and the certification to be available at multiple places, be recognized and usable at many places. This also brings, anytime there is an issue or there is a question, then the requirements are standardized by all the countries, or so it is one standard applicable to multiple countries and labs. They are continuously, therefore, evolving, and as part of this evolution, what used to be called as the evaluation assurance level, or EAL type of evaluation, has now evolved into another type of evaluation as well, called the protection profile. Basically, protection profile is a standard set of canned set of requirements for type of software or hardware, or type of technology. So if you look at firewalls or VPNs, they have all firewalls, they want a base requirements, and all firewalls, irrespective of which manufacturer is producing it, would have the same set of requirements met by this protection profile. Next slide, please. So this slide actually tells you what are the countries. We saw this, the flags, but I thought it would be nicer to also put the names of the countries here. So these are the names of the countries that are part of the common criteria. So if you look at it, there is an authorizing set and there's a consuming set. The authorizing ones means that they are full-fledged common criteria members, which is they recognize the certificate issued by other countries, and also they produce their own, or they issue their own certificates, meaning they have labs, they do the testing, the labs do the testing, and they have, and these countries have a group of assessors who assess these labs and recommend and issue the certificate. Whereas consuming is basically those who have shown an interest to be a full authorizing country, but they are in the process. So it's a two-step process. For any kind of new country that comes in would first become a consuming country, meaning they would they would accept the certificates, but they are not yet ready to issue their own certification, right? So maybe they don't have the labs, and maybe they don't have the scheme, as it is called, which is the authorizing division for the certificates, issuing division. So it's a two-step process, and as you can see, several countries are already in step one to become a full-fledged common criteria scheme, as they are called. Next slide, please. So pretty much I have, in some form or the other, I have talked about this. There are some keywords that gets used, and a TOE, as it is called, target of evaluation, is what we are testing. A TOE could be actually a piece of a bigger product, like FIPS, where it is always a piece of for product. The main difference between common criteria and FIPS in this is that common criteria could be, the TOE could be a distributor TOE, meaning it could be in many parts. Like you could have on management control, which is outside, and then you have another machine which is doing the work actually, right? So under this management control is managing that node, so to speak. So whereas in FIPS, it is always one single piece of unit of machine or hardware or software. It is never a distributed. And security target is again a key document which says what functionality is being tested and how it is being implemented by the product. Then there is a protection profile. I already mentioned protection profile is a set of requirements, implementation independent requirements for a particular type of technology. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the certification process. It's pretty much the same as or similar to FIPS. The manufacturer goes to the lab, gives a set of documentation, gives the product. The lab does their magic. They do the testing. They make sure that the documentation is consistent, correct, and clear. Then they write a report, give it to the government entity, which is called a scheme, and then the government entity reviews it and provides the certificate. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll kind of step through quickly because we have very little time left. So this, again, how to be successful. Make sure that I think the most important thing is, there are two most important things here. The first is to know your market and know, because based on the market that you're going to, whether it's US or Europe, you should go to either an EAL or a protection profile compliant validation. So that's important. The second is to do a pre-assessment to figure out what is missing, what you need to do to get the certificate, to be successfully certified. The last point there is the URL to the list of certificates that are already issued by this program. So again, be the leader, because nobody else has done it. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. Be the leader and raise the bar on the security. Next slide, please. So these are value proposals. I'm going to skip over it. You're going to get the slides and you can look at that. And so I want to give a few minutes for questions. So that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's it. All right. So I did see a couple of questions pop up. Kate, could you just read out those questions, please? Or maybe Vidya?
How serious is the FDA? Already seeing rejections due to cybersecurity findings. Yeah, so one of the big things we've seen is, according to my math, from October 1st of last year through Q2 of this year, there has been a 700% increase in rejections from the FDA that are specific to cybersecurity. And what we're finding with those rejections is they run the gamut from as simple as you do not have a threat model, or your SBOM is non-existent or insufficient, all the way through to very sophisticated cryptography feedback, talking about even algorithm choice and implementation. And in particular, we saw one even around key revocation processes. So the FDA is absolutely serious about enforcement. We know that it is a top priority for the FDA to focus on enforcement maturity, because I think historically one of the challenges is it's been a little lumpy. So device makers could get through sometimes and have insufficient security, which then just makes it harder for the product security people to justify why they need to invest. So from the FDA's various conversations throughout this year, we've seen a lot of conversation about how enforcement is going to become more ubiquitous, and they're putting processes such as eStar into place, which is basically a gate. Before you can even turn in your paperwork, you must demonstrate some degree of security consideration to even begin the review process. A reminder, if you have any questions, to feel free to put them up in the chat, and we're monitoring them there.
Yeah. Are there any more questions? I don't see any other question. I saw something pop up.
I can take the next one about the which regulators' recommendation should we follow? Obviously, that is driven by the market you want to introduce your device in, right? If you want to introduce in Europe, then it's MDR and IVDR. If it's the US, it's the FDA. They are largely overlapping from a requirements perspective and from a process perspective, so you can implement your cybersecurity practices to meet both requirements. There are some unique aspects to each of them you need to understand and address specifically. But again, I think it's largely driven by your marketing strategy. One I personally like to use as a reference is Australia, not because necessarily that I believe that Australia is a significantly important medical device market, but I think they have done a better job in providing a pragmatic approach on how to implement security. So I think it is easier to follow and can actually be a good framework to use for other markets as well, because again, it's much more technical and pragmatic than what other regulators have put forward. And then obviously there's a long slew of standards out there. AMI has published TR57 and SW96 for the pre-market risk management, as well as TR97 for post-market risk management. There's IC 81001-5-1 for pre-market management processes and practices. And then there is the HSCC Joint Security Plan here out of the US that is a good overview on how to stand up a framework and the right governance to implement a cybersecurity program for your environment. I think those are the highlights. And then Nitya had obviously her list in her slides for FIPS and common criteria.
Right.
Okay, and that looks like that'll be the end of our Q&A. Thank you all for joining today's webinar. The recording and the slides will be sent out after the session today. And please feel free to reach out to any of our speakers if you have any further questions. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.